Welcome to this fourth video of the Diaphanie overview series. I'm Paul Morin, I'm a cinematographer and one of the creators behind Diaphanie, that is distributed by HAL Picture. Today we're going to talk about the grain module. The first thing to know about our grain module is that we do not use a film scan to emulate the grain and blend it into the image. We actually use a grain emulation algorithm that recreates the behavior of film grain and applies that to the digital image. That gives you a fully generated procedural grain. And this has two major perks. The first one is it keeps the plugin light and efficient, both in terms of storage and resources. Real-time grain with Diaphanie is something you can achieve very easily with standard configuration. And that can be a hassle when you're handling several gigabytes of film data just to create your grain. More importantly, in my opinion, you get way more customization options with a procedural generated grain than with a film scan-based option, because it's an algorithm that works behind the scene, and we get access to many parameters of this algorithm to shape the exact render of the grain that we're creating. This means you can set up the grain to be as close as possible to a film grain. Diaphanie gets very convincing results when properly set up to emulate a proper modern 35mm film grain, more than most commercial solutions that are available in the market. It also means that you can embrace another direction. You can try and build a grain that is not necessarily sticking to the film reference. We give you the freedom to do that thanks to the fact that it's fully parametric. And that's what we're going to do in this deep dive. So let's check out our look development timeline. So as for every video we've done, the timeline is in an ACCCT color managed workflow, and all of the shots here that come from different cameras have been properly color managed. That way we can easily jump from shot to shot and see how the settings we apply are working on different situations. So let's apply a Diaphanie node instance and let's enable the grain. For the purposes of this demonstration, I'm going to increase the grain blend so that you can really see what's happening in spite of the compression of the YouTube videos and so on. And I'm going to zoom in very strongly in the image. It's to let you have a good preview of what the grain of Diaphanie looks like. When you enable the grain module, you get the default parameters are actually set up to mimic the modern 35mm film grain. And that's what we're seeing here. Let me just loop on that clip just for you to see how it plays out. So you can see we have some nice life to it. It's very lively, and we get our real time, no problem. So this is the default grain that Diaphanie offers you, and now we can customize it. If we look at the main parameters that are accessible, you get the grain softness. It's pretty self-explanatory. You can just make the grain look softer or sharper depending on the slider value. You also get access to a second parameter that I like quite a lot, that is called dye coupler. The dye coupler is based on the fact that when you shoot color film, the grain you'll get is actually going to be colored. And its color is going to be influenced by the different dyes in the 3 layers of film. You're not seeing the silver grains, you're seeing the dyes that are attached to the silver grains and that create the color of the film. Since our grain is parametric, you can actually reduce the effect of these dyes in the grain by reducing the dye coupler. And if you get to 0, you'll actually get a black and white grain, and you'll get a more contrasty grain as well. So it's like you're dosing the quantity of silver grains versus dye coupler that you get inside the grain. The next setting is grain size. So that's also pretty self-explanatory. You can see how we can change the grain size here. And the last global setting is the grain global blend. It's really just the intensity of the grain that you're blending in the image. As I said, I've willingly increased it a lot just for the purpose of this demonstration. Aside from these main global settings, you can access 3 other groups of settings. If you want to fine-tune the influence of the grain, its relative weight based on the brightness of the image, you can do that in the local influence group of settings here. Depending on where your area is in terms of exposure value, you can increase or decrease the presence of grain. If you want to visualize that, there's an option deep down here. It's called Visualize Grain, and you can check it. By default, it will just show you the layer of grain that is being blended into the image, but you can also choose the gradient option. And this way you have a gradient from lowlights to the highlights that lets you actually assess the quality of grain and the quantity of grain you're blending into these different exposure value zones. So if you want, for instance, if you think that there's too much or too little grain, you can see the grain here in the lowlights. You can decide to increase its presence by increasing here the grain in these two zones. And the grain here will have a lot of more presence. And so you can shape EV by EV, zone by zone, brightness zones by brightness zones. You can shape the quantity of grain, its relative presence into these different areas. Right next to these values, the grain edge gradient and the grain edge blur are two settings that allow you to control the way the grain will act on high contrast gradients and separation, on edges, basically. This is inspired by the acutance behavior of the grain alongside high contrast edges. You actually have a visualization option to look at these edges gradients. That's right here. So when you display that, you can see all the edges that the spatial analysis of the image is detecting. And you can see whether you're increasing the grain at that point or actually decreasing it in the edges. When you get dark edges, that means that there will be less grain applied in the edges. And you can change that by changing the grain edge gradients and actually reverse that and have the opposite effect, which is having more grains on the gradients. You can also decide to blur this grain at the edges, and you will feel less the separation between the volumes. Since it's based on a spatial analysis of the image, you can actually use these settings to reduce the quantity of grain in the high details of the image and avoid something sometimes a bit unnatural, a collision between high details and grain. That shouldn't really happen in film. Once you've taken care of the local influence of the grain, you can fine-tune its color. You have a saturation slider that is very self-explanatory, and it allows you to give more or less saturation to the grain layer. Aside from that, we actually got a bit creative because since our grain is based on random noise, if we left it to itself, it would be colored completely randomly. But the film grain is not randomly colored. So we actually had to implement a color correction on the grain to make it more filmic. And that's what called the grain curated color mix. We have one preset that is our curation that we use whenever we want to do a filmic grain that you can actually blend. So that's really easily blended here. And that if you want, you can actually do yourself. You can do a custom color mix if you want. So you just choose advanced and then get here in the advanced section. And you just get a lot of sliders because for each color of the cube, you get to modify the hue and the saturation for the grain. So the curated color mix helps us achieve a filmic grain because it really mimics the colors of the classic 35mm film grain. And you can see what it does by just blending it out. If you put 0 on the curated mix blend, you get the original random noise colors of the grain, and you can see that it has nothing filmic to it. So the color mix really helps us to achieve that filmic look if that's what you're looking for. The last advanced setting is called grain disparity. It's inspired by the filmic behavior of the grain. On modern films, the silver grains don't actually have a unique size. They're composed by two different sizes. The default grain size is complemented by a bigger size of grain that allows the film to be more sensitive, but it will also create a higher granularity in the lowlights. And that's what we've emulated here. You can actually decide which size relative to the basic size, which size the lowlight grains will be. By default, it's 1.2. That means the lowlight grains are 20% bigger than the standard grains. And you can also have decide where the lowlight stops and where the midtones and the rest of the image starts. So if we look at the gradient that we used previously to set up the local influence, you can see that I'm going to do something very, very strong just for the purpose of the demonstration. So if I put the low light grain size at 1.5, which means that the low light grains will be 50% bigger than the standard grains, then you can see here that if I increase the light threshold Here, the low light grains are way bigger than the standard grains here. And then when I reduce the light threshold, I get back here. I can see the wipe actually of the low light threshold, and I go back to my original grain size. These settings that we just covered, they allow you to do most of the use cases of the grain that you can encounter. But there is a final set of settings that are the grain generation options, and it's here in the advanced section. It's been designed for a very specific use, but let's have a look at it anyway. So the idea that you can decide that the grain is not going to change at every frame. Let's just have a look at it. If I put here a time step of 5 and I put play, you can see the grain changing every 5 frames. It's as easy as that. So why is it interesting? It's actually been implemented by us because our grain module has been used on animated movies. And some animation movies do not animate 24 frames per second, but they're still going to work on 24 frame per second timelines for distribution. So you want the grain to be synchronized with the animation rate, not the timeline frame rate. So if you animate a frame every 3 frames, then you have to put a grain tab steps of 3 if you want the grains to be synchronized with the animated movie. So it's as easy as that. It's really made for animation movies, but you can use it for very different purposes. If you're shooting slow shutter, for instance, or if you want to have specific offbeat kind of rendering in music videos or commercials or stuff like that. It can be an experimental place, is what I'm saying. But at first, it was designed to accommodate for some specific confirmation use cases. And that covers our deep dive on the grain module for Diaphanie. As for every Diaphanie module, you get access to our built-in presets. We've included several film-like presets and other effects that you can test out and customize, of course, and fine-tune. Feel free to work from them. Feel free to start from scratch. And feel free to share your presets and try and build up your own preset library as you get acquainted with the plugin. So that concludes the overview of Diaphanie. I really hope the plugin was to your liking and that you were able to test it out with a lot of enjoyment. We try and had a lot of material in our YouTube channel and on our website to support your look developments. So feel free to dive into that. Feel free to contact us if you have any questions. And thanks a lot for watching.